So let me just jump right in. I know this is a pretty charged statement, and I truly do mean that I think strategy is in crisis, and that's not just for new companies, but it's for all companies, partly because of how it's perceived and understood, and partly because of the tools that we use to create it. Let me just give you a quick background on me, since probably most of you have never heard of me before. I'm a designer by training, starting in industrial design, specifically car design, but I really grew up in information design, which at that time, because I have some gray hair here, was mostly in print. And this taught me really how to make complex data into clear information. It really taught me the value of clarity and dealing with large data sets. Design's actually interesting because it brings a helpful set of skills to business in identifying things that business people usually don't see. Part of that is in the ability to build new models, identify other things that are happening, and then do something with that information in order to create new kinds of experiences. After information design, I quickly moved, and really I grew up in interaction design, starting with application software and then CD-ROMs and then onto websites and recently cryptocurrency. So I'm familiar with all of the technology, but always with a focus on how do we make value for customers. Along the way, my experiences and my insights have given me the opportunity and the background to write and develop and contribute to a series of books, most of them on design, but increasingly on business. And because I have been a consultant for 30 years or over 30 years, working with startups, working with large and medium-sized companies in all sorts of industries, I have increasingly been a strategist for these companies, helping them to identify opportunities, what's working, what's not. So much so that about, oh geez, 10, I guess about 14, 15 years ago, I went off and got my own MBA. And I got an MBA. At the time, was the only MBA that was accredited in the United States for sustainable management. And in that experience of learning traditional business tools in a non-traditional way, it also gave me the impetus to, because I'm a designer, I always have to do it better. And I started a project and was given the opportunity to create my own MBA program. And while people think of this as an MBA for designers, it really isn't, although we get a lot of people from design fields. It really was an opportunity to rethink what would an MBA be like for the 21st century. And it gave us the opportunity to rethink methods and pedagogy, curriculum and topics. And along the way, it's helped us identify where tools are deficient and processes are deficient and what might replace them so that we could do things better. I've also been an entrepreneur myself, so I know what it's like. I've started several ventures, some successful, some not so successful. And I feel fortunate to have actually grown up in Silicon Valley, where starting a company wasn't a myth. It was something that the next door neighbors do. So I come by my entrepreneurialism very naturally, and I could say natively. But you're here to hear about why I think strategy is in crisis. So let's start in. The first thing I want to bring up is that newly portrayed research, this research mostly coming out of McKinsey, but has also been talked about elsewhere, is really calling the alarm about the majority of companies worldwide not being able to, for instance, escape their debt spirals. So McKinsey has defined these companies as zombie companies, which are companies that can't essentially out-earn the service on their debt. And this is nothing new. Companies have, there's been many companies that have been in this situation before. What's absolutely gobsmackingly shocking about their research is that, according to their research, 85% of companies worldwide are in or near this situation. This is unheard of, and it's growing. I just want you to let that sink in for a moment. 85% of companies are in this situation where they're not providing enough value, they're not earning enough value to service their debt, or they're barely in this situation. And they're certainly not on a path to grow These are essentially companies that would probably be better off if they closed up, returned all their capital, sold everything and returned all the capital to their stakeholders or their shareholders, and allowed their shareholders to go invest it in either other companies or even just in mutual funds, indexed funds into the market, and get a better return than the operations of these companies. This isn't a ringing endorsement about the value of how corporations are managed, and it is a tremendous indictment in my mind about the value of strategy, because most of these companies are performing strategy. Many of them are consulting and bringing in strategic consultants, either as individuals or as companies. And still, all the money that they are spending on strategic services and strategic processes are doing them no good, because 85% of them are stuck and can't get out of this debt spiral. This isn't a technological problem either. It's a tool problem partly, and it's mostly an understanding problem. And it's probably, in my opinion, the single biggest, most important problem and dirty little secret of the business world. Every company in the world needs to determine if they're a zombie or near to being a zombie company, because it makes you incredibly vulnerable to the changes that happen in the market, especially in terms of crisis, in times of crisis like COVID-19, for instance. But the danger is that with greater transparency and more of this kind of reporting, your markets, your competitors, other investors, regulators, et cetera, may also see that you're barely making it as a zombie company, and that you have few options. That just compounds the problems that these companies have. After probably climate change and maybe credit default swaps, this to me is the biggest problem with business worldwide that needs to be confronted. And the biggest question then about this is, what can companies do about it? Let's also not forget to ask how much of this value is going to society, and to all stakeholders, not just shareholders. So in a world where, Facebook is likely in this top 15% of high growth companies that are creating tons of value, it's clearly debatable at this point whether Facebook is a net value or a net problem to civilization itself. So even in the financial context of a zombie company doesn't mean that strategy is serving these companies in order to serve the societies, the communities that they live in. Part of the reason is, like I said, that traditional processes for strategy have always been deficient, and that the tools are increasingly becoming out of date. Part of this is that most strategy, certainly that's done wholly within the firm, and certainly this is how we teach business students to do their work in traditional programs, download some templates, plug into the data that you know, fill it out, and voila, you have the basics of strategy. Not only are the templates old, out of date, and incomplete, but they reflect old thinking about what companies should be doing and what value is and how companies need to relate to their customers. Not a single one of these templates here, and these are popular templates to use, actually identify or use customer decision drivers as the plug-in data that strategy and the strategic process is built on. In other words, there's all sorts of other things that get plugged into these processes. There's a mix of internal and external factors. So market conditions get mixed up with operational internal divisions. The biggest thing is that there's no evidence for most of these things that get filled out in an earnest, honest attempt to do strategy within a company. And if you're not filling these out with the factors that drive your customers' decisions, you're not doing strategy correctly, for one, and you're likely on the wrong path and emphasizing and focusing on the wrong things. As silly as this example looks like, this is how the majority, I think, of positioning strategic processes happen. Certainly, we teach this to business school students on how to do this. But because we're all smart and we know what we're doing in our companies, We know our markets. We don't have to do research because we already know what the conditions are. So we go and plug in these empty slots, Mad Lib style, the things that we quote unquote know about our market, our customers, our competitors, et cetera. We don't bother with the research. So none of this is derived. And it all rests on our assumptions that are essentially never validated or checked. As silly as this looks, this is an extreme example of what happens every day when people try to perform strategy for themselves, or I'm sorry to say, when they hire people to help them perform strategy. Another problem with strategy and why it's in crisis is that it's usually done out of sequence. So only some of the processes are done. They're done sort of haphazardly out of sequence. They're not done completely. And that means that the data between these sections, these sub parts of the process, often don't relate and are even in conflict with each other. So what about the incomplete pieces and the value that they require us to focus on? Essentially, in many companies, even in consulting situations, these just simply aren't done. These are left unanswered as questions. The biggest problem with traditional processes is that almost always, the majority of cases, the only data that's put into these processes is quantitative data because it's really easy to find numbers about prices, numbers about features, adoption, et cetera. And this is really important data, but it's not all the data. So we use incomplete templates in outdated ways, out of sequence. We use them incompletely, and then we fill them with only half of the important data. That's essentially what's going on here, and there's more. Because we don't bother to validate this data, certainly our assumptions about customers, maybe we do market research and we pull that market and competitive data in, but so many business people are loath to actually talk to their customers, or they only do it in quantitative ways like filling out customer satisfaction surveys, that the most important insights on which they could innovate and on which they could focus their strategy are just left off the table to begin with. And so the culture of not invented here, or we know our business, why do we need to talk to others? This is really common, especially for managers and leaders who only trust the numbers to begin with. That too makes for deficient strategy. Another problem with how this is done traditionally is it's almost never connected to the actual ongoing activities of a company. So it's a plan made for the future. You output a strategic plan, but then you never check day to day against that plan. So any adjustments that need to be made or any deficiencies of the plan itself don't get addressed until you redo the plan 3 to 5 years later. Again, putting in quant research through this and limiting it to quant becomes a problem. The next thing that one of the last things that is a problem is that we only bother to do this sort of strategic planning every few years, often in the 3 to 5 year time frame. We spend all this time and energy, we create a strategic plan. Most often we don't even communicate it down the chain to everyone else in the organization, which is incredibly important. And then we put it on shelf for 3 to 5 years, never look at it again, and start the whole process later. This is a tremendous waste of the energy and the information that we put into it in the first place. In summary, we're just not doing strategy very well. We're doing it haphazardly. We're only looking at some of the data. We're really not customer centric. It's often reactive and myopic, and it's not connected to day-to-day activities. Most of all, there's very little validation of the most important assumptions. So why I'm here to begin with is I think we can fix this, and I think we can fix it fairly easily. We need a new model for strategy because better strategy is continuous. In this sense, it's circular. It follows a set sequence, and it's constant. It connects to the activities of a company and the learnings, and then it uses both qual and quant research throughout the process. It happens in real time. And if we can build a real-time model, that means we can run the real-time model against all of the continuous activities of an organization in that real time. So as we do things, they're always checkable against our strategy. It's not that we put it on a shelf and look at it every year or every 3 to 5 years. It means that strategy becomes a continuous uh, activity within our company. Now, all of this requires better research, and that qual and quant research becomes the evidence of the decisions that we make in strategy. Most importantly, is the fact that the output of each process becomes the input of every other process. So as we move through these processes, we build a circular, continuous stream of data that informs what we're doing in the company against what we had thought we were going to focus on, and how we're going to keep modifying and evolving the strategy in real time rather than just ignoring it for 3 to 5 years. This is the model we need to move to. And in order to do that, some of this is easy, just using better data, using more complete data, doing all the steps and doing them in sequence. That's actually not very hard at all. Part of the difficulty, though, is that we actually need new tools completely. We also need new understandings. And some of this is just, I know it sounds completely obvious. The reality is this is not how it's actually done in business today. So there's a new formula that I'd like to introduce as a fundamental understanding of how businesses run. Value comes from relationships which occur in experiences. And what I mean by that is that you can't build or exchange value without the context of a relationship, and that you can't have a relationship unless you have experiences. So let me talk about some of these things in more detail. First of all, there's 5 kinds of value, and I know that flies in the face of most traditional business teaching. There's this is what we teach in our program, for instance. The top kind, the top on this list, functional and financial, that's the kind that most traditional businesses starts and ends with. It's the easy stuff. It's the kind of value that's easy to measure in quantitative ways. It's the most visible value. It's the most easy to work with, but it's not the most important. Let me run through these really quickly. This is obvious. Functional value is responds to what customers ask in terms of, I have certain kinds of features or certain kind of performance requirements. When I'm looking at my alternatives, I ask very obviously, does this do what I need it to do? That's great. It's really understandable. But recognize that this is the shallowest point at which to build a relationship with a customer. One step more inward is financial value. And so now the question of the customer is, does this do what I need it to do at a price I feel is worth it, at a price I'm willing to pay for? Because we all can, identify cars that meet our transportation needs, but not everyone's willing to pay for a Bentley or a Ferrari. They're perfectly happy with a Honda, a Hyundai, or a bicycle for that matter. So we all have these different points at which we're willing to pay for that functionality. That's great. This is, well known in business. Again, this is the sort of simple stuff that business focuses on every day. However, once we move one step closer to who our customers are, we move from the quantitative to the qualitative. And now the questions get more difficult to understand. What we ask ourselves as customers is, how does this make me feel? Does it make me feel, in the car example, does it make me feel successful? Does it make me feel sexy? Does it make me feel desirable from other people's perspective? These are legitimate questions that every car salesman knows and in fact counting on. Because if the conversation with a customer comes down to price and features, the salesman already knows that he's pretty much lost the sale. All of his or her ability to convince someone that this is a better car for them goes out the window if it's just a quantitative decision. I have this budget and I have these needs that need to be met. What happens at this emotional level is that it becomes invisible to most business people, except for those salespeople, because what happens in our heads is often unconscious or subconscious, and we don't talk about it. And we often, as customers, don't even realize that we keep looking in the corner of the dealership at that red convertible, because that's what it is when you're a man of my age. and that our decisions around which car to buy are being influenced by more than just our, obvious, quantitative, very rational, we call this rational decision making, identified needs. In fact, emotional decision drivers often are so powerful that they override what we think of as quote unquote rational decision drivers of function and price, financial and functional value. Every salesperson knows this. Everyone who has a premium brand knows this, but it's not in the tools that we use to both evaluate opportunities, design, develop, and distribute them, and then to review them later. And we're only halfway through this list of kinds of value. There is deeper value that has even more impact, that where the question is absolutely subconscious and we make decisions about products and services and other kinds of experiences based on whether we relate to them, whether they're part of our identity. This is where a lot of brand lives, for instance. And while many people don't think that they have a premium brand, this is the money they're leaving on the table, or I should say the value they're leaving on the table. If they don't put this kind of data through their strategic processes, they have no hope to ever get that out of their strategic plan and therefore build this kind of value in the marketplace for real. Lastly, there's meaningful value, which really is about our worldview. This is where lots of our religion and politics live. It sways our ability to understand a situation, not just to make decisions about it. It's incredibly deep. It doesn't change very often, and therefore it's a very stable form of value. Companies that can relate to their customers at these deeper levels, emotion, identity, and meaning, have more stable relationships with their customers, which mean they can derive more value from those customers over the long term. It's also a hedge against competition, because if a competitor comes in and offers a cheaper price for the same thing, their customers, your customers, are less likely to go for that cheaper price if you have built a relationship with them at these deeper levels. So it's more stable, it's more value, and it's more defensible. So we have these two categories of value, the quantitative and the qualitative, and it's not a surprise to all of us in business that our business tools mostly or almost completely focus on the top two, the quantitative. But I want to make sure you understand those are the shallowest kinds of value. So features and price is almost always the discussion within companies, especially around innovation and new products and services. But business people aren't stupid. I don't want to give this impression. Most business people know that there's something else at work, because they don't even behave around the saying, nobody will pay more for something, right? If you ever hear someone saying that, look at what they're wearing, what kind of car do they drive, look at what kind of watch they're wearing, absolutely everyone pays quote unquote more for things. They may not do it for every product category, but they do it for some product categories because they're engaged at this level. So brand is one way of starting to try to figure out how to describe this. And there are 7 different kinds of definitions or equations for brand. None of them are correct. None of them are consistent. It's just a way to quantify this other value that's on the table. Part of the problem with these equations, though, and these measurement systems, is that they stick only to easily quantifiable things. They still ignore the qualitative, and that's the bulk of what's happening here. Another way to describe this in typical economic terms or business terms is lifetime customer value. And again, we have these really complex equations that still aren't correct, partly because they're only using quantifiable data to put into the equation in the first place. But there's evidence that even the most quantitatively minded in business are trying to grapple with how to figure out how to define this extra kind of data, extra kind of value. So let me give you an example. It's fairly recent. It's only 8 years old. When Instagram was purchased in 2012 by Facebook, We can look back at the balance sheet, and the day before the day before the sale, the balance sheet said that it was an $86 million company. We know that the day after the sale, it was bought for 1.1 billion. So the balance sheet has to show $1.1 billion, which means there was an extra $1 billion sitting in this company that none of the accounting tools, none of the financial management tools, and therefore none of the decision management tools could even see. Wasn't even visible until Instagram got purchased. And what's happening here is, in the language of business, they had built premium value. This is another way of saying, extra special stuff that's invisible and that we can't measure, but we find out how much is there because we know there's some of it there, but only when a company IPOs or a company is bought by another company. And the difference between these two is what's in accounting terms called book value, what the books say the company's worth. And then the day after all this extra money shows up, it has to be shoved into the balance sheet into some category because the balance sheet has to balance. And so accountants have invented this category called goodwill, which just means, oh, people really, really like us a lot. But if you look at this equation or you look at this list, which of the numbers is the biggest? And I'm not talking about the number on the bottom, the total value. It's the goodwill. It's the premium or qualitative value. It absolutely far outpaces the book value that all of the business decisions and certainly the financial decisions of the company were based on. Now, Instagram was started by a group of people, founders, that knew that there was more, that they were building more. So they weren't making all of their decisions strictly on the financial basis. Most startup founders don't, but not all. The problem is how much they trust the process and they trust their gut. Because if you look at the finances every quarter and you run your company by the finances, you are making decisions that are actually decreasing that value, that goodwill value, that $1.1 billion value, and you'll never be able to create it, which is what every investor hopes you create, and it's what every founder hopes to create because they want to reap the benefits of that. This isn't, by the way, limited to technology companies. Any healthy company that IPOs or gets purchased by another company has that qualitative value, that invisible value suddenly show up on the balance sheet afterwards. Maybe it's not quite as extreme as this example with Instagram, but it's always a multiple over what the books say the company is worth. So an easy way of saying this, and this becomes an imperative in decision making within companies, is that those companies and people who focus on the total value, the qual and the quant, are in a better position to create more of it and do so more often. Again, when you're talking to certain kinds of business people, if you use the term premium, that's the signal that there's this extra special attribute to this value that isn't otherwise accounted for. Just be careful that you're not talking to a traditional business person who doesn't think that you're in a premium category or you're in a premium industry. Every industry, every category can reap premium value. Not everyone understands that. So this, to restate this new relationship, this new formula, is that there's 5 kinds of value, and that value sits within a relationship. No relationship, you don't get any value. Poor relationships give you poor value. And that relationship sits within the context of an experience. I know, again, this sounds pretty obvious, but this is not the kind of conversation that regularly happens within business. And this is why so many companies fail to create a lot of value. There are, by the way, 6 dimensions of experience, value being one of them, because it is so important that it's one of the 6 dimensions that has to be attended to when you're designing new kinds of experiences and you're designing new products and services to deliver to customers. I can go into the rest of the dimensions of experience later too. So more and better value yields better relationships. Better relationships yield better experiences, which yield new opportunities to create new value. I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself. I am, because this is so poorly understood and put into practice in traditional businesses. Now, all of this new qualitative value requires new research methods and new tools to use that and put into the strategic process. We simply need new insights. We need to understand the why of our customers, not just the what and the when. We also need new tools. So we are building new tools to use this new data to put through the strategic process so that when we have a strategic plan come out, it's focused exactly on where the best opportunities are to capture that other value. One of these tools is stakeholder analysis. This comes out of the systems thinking world. And the way that we use this is sort of next generation on how environmental analysis is done in strategy. Now, not everyone does an environmental analysis process. That's part of the problem with strategy as it's practiced. But even where they do, they only look at a limited number of stakeholders, and they're mostly just looking for quote unquote trends. What we're looking for when we use stakeholder analysis is to map that 5 kinds of value so that we can see where the opportunities in the business ecosystem are to identify new opportunities for new kinds of value. Very often it's not within the company, or it might be with employees within the company. Very often it's with our partners throughout the supply chain, our investors, NGOs and government agencies, all sorts of places that usually get left out of the strategic process. Another tool that we have is called the wave line, and this is a way of mapping that value across the customer experience over the entire customer timeline. And then it becomes very clear where the best opportunities are to focus our efforts for product and service development. So this is actually a strategic tool. And one I have to wait until it stops scrolling, apparently. Okay. We also need to consider other tools that we commonly use within the strategy process, like the SWOT analysis, which is just so poorly implemented. I can't tell you enough. What happens in when we, and especially we sadly teach this in traditional business programs to business students on how to do this. And it's so lazy because we mix internal and external market and customer issues. We ignore customer decision drivers, right? We put up what we quote unquote know about our industry or our customers or our competitors. And we put them up with absolutely unverified market research. If there's any market research, it's probably quantitative or restricted to quantitative and not qualitative. But essentially, we're doing that Mad Libs thing again because we're so smart and we're so experienced. We know our business. We can just sit and list in a group setting what's important here, and voila, we have now done a SWOT analysis. And they're mostly worthless. Instead, in reconsidering the SWOT, we have to take that environmental analysis data, both qual and quant, pull it through because the output of that becomes the input of competitive analysis, and then pull the output of that into positioning. When you do that, you get a completely different set of customer decision drivers that you can evaluate yourself against your customers or your competitors. Your strengths and weaknesses, your opportunities get completely refocused on what's really an opportunity and not just something that was a guess that came up out of groupthink. Again, I want to stress that these are validated decision drivers of customer decisions, and they're validated by research. And this is what's mostly missing from all of these tools, because they don't get, it never gets done. The research never gets done. So essentially, garbage gets put into these tools, and it's no surprise that garbage is what comes out of it. So in summary, I'm going to wrap up here. I could go into a lot more detail. Believe me, I'll spare that for you. But we have some new understandings in business that we have to come to. One is that everyone is in the relationship business. There's no way out of this. If you ignore that you're in the relationship business, it just means that you create terrible relationships, and your ability to derive value is going to be hindered as a result. And I know, again, this sounds obvious, but not everyone believes that their relationships are important. Anyone that uses Comcast, anyone that has had a bad experience with a company or a vendor where they didn't feel like it was a very good relationship knows how important that relationship is. And if you're not paying attention to it, you create bad relationships. You don't get to opt out of the relationship business. Similarly, everyone's in the experience business. And unfortunately, this has been messaged poorly in the business world for 20 years, where experience businesses were deemed these special kind of places like Disneyland or maybe Starbucks, or concerts where people paid to get into the experience and then paid for more products and services inside them. That's not what an experience business is, because every company is an experience business in the sense that every company is delivering some kind of experience. When you have a good or bad experience, when you're using a product, when you're interfacing with a service, you know when you're having a good or bad experience, and you know that you're in the experience business. But in the business world, we've trained leaders to believe that it's possible to not be in the experience business because they're a commodity business or a product company or a service company. So they aren't in this category. And that leads them to make strategic and operational decisions throughout the company every day in real time that ignore that they're making and delivering experiences, and therefore delivering poor ones. So the best opportunities for new value are going to come from better relationships and better experiences. So we need to prioritize the qualitative research that identifies those other new kinds of value among customers and stakeholders, and then use those to prioritize how we build our strategy. There's some other factors here too. Not every organization's culture is the same, especially when it comes to innovation. What we found through research, and this comes from Cheskin research, is that there are 5 basic kinds of cultures here. And it's not that one culture is better than another culture. What it means is that we have to identify the culture of our companies in order to understand how best to make decisions and work within them. For instance, the innovation outsourcers, they just can't innovate inside, period. They don't have a culture that supports it. That's okay. They still innovate by buying usually other companies or new tools or new kinds of opportunities. That's how they innovate. They purchase it. Great. That's fine. But if you're a manager inside that company trying to use a design thinking process, for instance, you're going to get nowhere. And you have to determine that upfront. Lastly, we need to connect all of our activities to corporate strategy. And there's a really easy way to start doing this. This doesn't do it all. This is something I did within my own program, where I listed our 5 strategic plan objectives, our big 5 strategies, right alongside my budget. And I color coded every single budget item with one of those strategy, because that thing allowed us to deliver on those strategies. And guess what? Anything that wasn't attached to a strategic objective, that became a great conversation and a necessary conversation that maybe we shouldn't be doing that at all. If we couldn't connect it to what the company needs to do, why are we spending that money and why are we doing that thing at all? It also becomes a really good conversation that backs up why you're saying you need money to do something or why you need more budget to do something, because it connects it right up to the top of the company's objectives. And I guarantee you that's a much more interesting and puts you in a much better position to have that conversation than you do if it's just about what's your total budget and you need to cut 5% across the board, da, 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 da. We need to better understand the why of customers, not just the how and the when, which is what quantitative research does, and then use that to pull through all of our decisions when it comes to strategy. Now, there's other tools too. There's more strategic tools. There's better leadership tools on my website. I identify these tools specifically because they've become so helpful in helping organizations assess where they are, where identify where they could be, and manage how they're going to get there, basically. So I welcome you to go to the website and click on these tools and learn more about them. I'm happy to talk about all of them, but for now, I'm going to end there so I don't overload your heads with information. Okay.
Awesome, great presentation. I love the slides, very beautiful design, but the content is amazing. I'm also the strategy guy. I'm building strategy for many years, and I'm impressed with the quality of details. And yeah, it's really interesting. We do have a couple of questions, but before we go into those questions, I have a question. Based on the audience we have on the community,
Yeah.
we have like uh, about half of the community it's early stage startups, about pre-seed stage, about 35% I think seed stage, and the rest are around A or higher. And so the level of details for the strategy you are talking about is important for any size company. I would agree with that. But sometimes it's early stage, they don't have
Yeah.
enough time for
Yeah.
detailed analysis or something like that. Could you advise a sequence of steps to do the strategy for early stage teams, so they can innovate faster and iterate faster?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. By the way, I'll send you my slides, and if there's a place to post them, you're more than welcome to post them. I don't think it. I've started companies. I'm starting a new one right now. I completely understand the lack of time and resources. I'm not saying everyone needs to go hire an expensive strategic consulting firm. I think it's less a matter of how much you do at any step, but that you at least do every step. And it might be that at one of these steps you just sit down for 2 hours with your team and you discuss what the pieces of that step are. um, just to consider it once in a while is better than to ignore it altogether. So I would still guide people to go through the steps. It doesn't mean, for instance, talking to customers is probably the most important thing you could ever do. It's what people hate to do, especially folks that are quant focused. But I'll tell you, and you don't have to do a huge research study and talk to hundreds of people. You can go talk to 12 people deeply using the right questions and doing the right kind of research, and you will probably get 75 or 80% of the most important stuff, that you findings and insights that you would get out of research. Then, especially if your investors or other people question the fact that you only talk to 12 people, then you take the results of that qualitative research, and then you can build an actual quantitative survey that's informed by these important things that you found out. And then you can send that out to hundreds of people, to the delight of your investors and people who are judging your due diligence. But if you never do the qual step and the in-depth step, you'll never uncover those important insights. So it doesn't have to be done expensively, but you do need to do a little bit of it. And that goes for all of these tools. A lot of them, if you do the research right in the beginning, a lot of them you can just knock out in a couple hours, as long as you're using the right research to begin with.
Yeah, totally agree. Especially about the part about talking to customers. So this is, I think, the golden opportunity for any company to get the most important information, so they have the highest chances to succeed. Just because their target audience is telling them what exactly they want. Um, Another question we have here, and everyone
Yeah.
who is watching right now, us. Please use this opportunity to ask your specific question to Nathan while he's here, and he will try to address this question. Um, and if you would like to ask this question verbally, there is a button down here. You just press the button raising your hand, and we will let you speak. You can ask your question verbally. Just use this opportunity. Um, um, the question is, in terms of building a go-to-market strategy, what are the key elements for entrepreneur to include in their go-to-market strategy so they can start their business operations?
Yeah, I think that the first element is just to restructure your thinking about what's important and what's necessary. I think when a lot of people talk about go to market, they talk about it in the same breath as something like a minimal viable product, right? And part of the problem of the concept of a minimal viable product, which is driven by very important, very reasonable goals of we can't do everything, we can't boil the ocean, we have to get out there with something and prove the market. So what's the minimum we can do to get into the market and start exploring? The problem with that minimization, and again, I understand why it's there. You don't have tons of people and resources and money to build it all. But part of that minimization process often cancels out or takes out of the process what become the most important pieces of it, right? The most important value. So in that process, we usually end up with the most important feature set that we can get out in X amount of time, which is not the same set of features that is the most important feature set that we could provide the best value for people and get them excited and get them using our product. So I understand the need, but if you're, in any go-to-market process, you need to identify where the most value is, and then put that into the question and the equation of what can we build soon and get out there with. Because if you go out there with all the low value stuff, you get low value back, and then you decide that, or your market decides that there's nothing there for you.
Yeah, and after you explained what you mean under value,
Yeah.
that's 5 elements of value, then it means like the algorithm of steps we could do to build this strategy. Actually, we have one person that would like to ask a question, which is Michael.
Yeah.
Michael, we're going to let you talk. Michael, turn on your microphone. You can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, I'm so excited. So many questions, but I'll try to focus on one. I believe that default decision making going forward is a kiss of death, and you're the walking dead, especially with large corporate, and that agility is a superpower. What do you think about that? What does that mean to the entrepreneur and the relevance of things like applied critical thinking, not just the abstraction, but the reality of it in a real world scenario? What do you think about those personal skills and tools?
Yeah, I think they're absolutely critical. Thank you, Michael. Business as usual didn't work before, and it hasn't worked for a long time, and it's certainly not going to work going forward. I did just as an example, I did a project down in Australia, consulting for a big publisher once about how to revive their products. And I hate to say it, but every manager that I talked to was more interested in talking about their golf game than talking about their business. And this was right before the internet essentially wiped out their revenues. And I brought that to them. I said, you need to be looking at these new technologies. They're changing the equations for value. You have an opportunity to get in and be the first mover in this and keep your customers, keep your value. And they just, it wasn't something that they had been, have ever dealt with. They were all, gray haired like I am now, and they just really didn't care. So I think that, leaders and managers, decision makers in companies really do need to address the fact that the ways that they've done things in the past just aren't going to cut it. And that's really scary. I mean, they're stepping off into an unknown territory, and all of us as humans do everything we can to reframe things as, no, this is okay. I know what this is. I can deal with it, right? And that's just not the case. Compounded with even more technological advances today, compounded with things like COVID-19, which is a global phenomenon, right? There is no reason and no excuse not to start addressing these things except for human nature. So that critical thinking skills need to be combined with creative thinking skills and probably strategic and systems thinking skills, because the way that we've done things in the past, the way that we've gotten to where we are not going to help us out of this. I think it's Einstein that said, right, the thinking that got us into this problem, I'm paraphrasing here, it necessarily is not going to be the thinking that gets us out of this problem.
You know, you had mentioned also about the importance of relationship equity, and I'd like to add to that behavioral patterns. As somebody who plays in the corporate venture world, I've even seen post-COVID a corporate venture fund out of Boston commit to an opportunity where they've never shook the hand of the individual. They've done it only over Zoom. I've never seen that done before. So there are systemic shifts that are going on, but I think it's plays to the advantage of the entrepreneur. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's things, you know, where we are all humans, and as long as you're dealing with humans, whether you're in a B2C or a B2B context, those human drivers are always going to be there. They shift over time, sometimes with culture, but the fact is that, you know, as humans, we have fears and needs and desires and aspirations and things we understand and things we don't and things we think we do, even if we don't. And all of that factors into how people make decisions, how they manage relationships, what they look for, the value they look for. And if you know, so all of this is a human process. It's not a financial process. It's not a data process. It's not a, you know, a quantitative process, or which we like to think of as business processes. They're all human processes. And if we can't recognize that, we're just not equipped to make the right decisions.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate your question. We have more questions. In the meantime, if anyone else would like to ask a question verbally, just raise your hand. We'll let you talk. We have a question on live stream from, just a second, from Michelle Messina. The question is, Nathan, looks like we have 6-12 months more of pandemic-related and economic stress. Are you proposing that companies do mini strategy step review?
I think that it becomes more imperative, and Michael alluded to this, that we look at these factors, because our hands are, you know, we essentially have one hand tied behind our back doing business, can't even do business the traditional ways, most companies. So by its very nature, we need to look to new ways to do business, new ways to engage our customers. Now, of course, that's very much bounded by what category you're in. If you're a bar, you are, you know, your options are much more limited. But we've seen amazing innovation. Basically, every fine restaurant has turned into a bar, just a takeout one. We've seen innovation with people in boutiques, businesses, small retail, gyms, for instance, trying to work within these constraints. But most of us aren't as bound as we think we are. And by analyzing the relationships that we have and the relationships that are possible, I believe it's possible to identify new things that we can offer that continue to offer value, therefore we can get value back in exchange.
Awesome. The other question I have related to going global, and I mean, we are global world community. So what would be the strategy or recommendations for building global strategy for entrepreneurs? Like my professor at Stanford, where I used to study entrepreneurship, he said to me one thing which I can't forget ever. Once you have your website up and running, you are already global if you want it or not. And if you want to compete with someone or not, it's your choice, but you are global and you're taking your choice to not to compete or compete. What would be your advice or recommendations for building global strategy for startup founders, especially?
Yeah, you and your professor are both right. We are in a global world, and you get out on Twitter or you put something on the net and you're instantly global, except you're also not, right? Like you have to attract those eyeballs. I think the biggest thing I would recommend or recommend that people do is you can't boil the ocean. You know, investors are always saying, well, is this $1 billion opportunity? Well, you never just make $1 billion all of a sudden, right? You start with $100,000 and you grow to $1 million and you grow to 10 and $100 million. Like you grow into a global audience. And I think that that's the reality. If you can't, you know, if you speak English and you put your services out there in English, you're probably doing better than most. But depending on who you're trying to reach, you may need to speak a different language. You may need to respond to different visual cues. One thing I didn't talk about is one of the dimensions of experience is called triggers. And what that means is that different people, we signal value to people in different ways. And a lot of that is culturally bounded, right? So if I have this example I could sort of show here, I'll just, if I can share my screen. Okay, so we have triggers, and this is habitually where design always played. Every design decision, what something looks like and what typeface and color and what it should smell like, and all these things are really done with the understanding, when they're done right, of these decisions trigger meaning in people. And it triggers different kinds of meaning in different kind of people. So there's very little going on in this shoe, for example. There's about 3, maybe 4 design decisions and triggers, but they're very powerful ones. Some people look at this shoe and think, wow, I got to get me a pair of those. I can't wait to step out in these. Other people look at this and they have an intense negative reaction. I wouldn't be caught dead in this. And like I said, there's very few design decisions here. So this speaks to how powerful, you know, gold lame and you know, patent white leather and this big Gucci logo can have on people. And it triggers meaning in people in different ways, such that it will turn some people off and turn other people on. This is this great ad campaign from, I think it was really 90s and 2000s, from HSBC, that really communicates that the same design decision, the same thing, triggers different things in different people. So if you want to have a global audience, you need to understand what those triggers are, basically. And that takes a certain amount of research. So I would suggest and recommend to people that they start with who they know. They start with communities that they either understand well or have researched, get a foothold, and then grow out from there. But being mindful of those triggers in order to create the same kinds of deep relationships with new communities.
Thank you. Another question we have about B2B, building B2B strategy in B2B. You were talking a lot about value that seems like relevant for B2C, but when you do business with other companies, the sales cycle is maybe from 6 to a year, or maybe 2 years cycle. And what would be your strategy advice on building a successful path to your customers in B2B?
First of all, thank you for asking this question. I get it a lot. It's a really important question. And I would just say, and this may take a leap of faith for some people, everything that I've said is as applicable to B2B as it is B2C. And that's because as long as you're dealing with a human, all of those human attributes are still active. They get masked in different ways. And it's very easy for us to say, oh, my customers just care about price. The conversation is just about price. So let me give you an example where B2B, where this is very clear in a B2B situation. I don't know how, I can't see everyone, but Danil, you're not nearly as old as I am. So I don't know how many people here can answer this question or fill in this blank. I know Michael probably can, but there's a famous saying in business: nobody ever got fired for hiring blank. Any idea who that is, Danil?
No, it doesn't come to my mind.
No, yeah.
Blank.
So again, it's a fairly old reference. Nobody ever got fired for hiring. Yeah, there it is right there.
IBM.
IBM. right?
Okay.
The thing to understand, so these are B2B relationships, right? IBM is selling their services to other companies. The thing to understand here is that IBM was never the cheapest of the possible vendors. And quite frankly, sorry to say, they were usually never the best possible vendor either. So why were they so successful at selling services? It turns out the hidden decision driver that maybe IBM's salespeople knew or not, but the thing that made them so successful is that so many managers and deciders within their vendors were afraid to lose their job. They were afraid to make the wrong decision. And they knew that IBM was seen as the gold standard. So even if the product failed miserably, even if all this money was lost, they could say, well, you know what? We hired IBM. And if IBM couldn't do it, then pretty much nobody could. So you can't, so don't fire me. You can't blame me. So it turns out that the desire to keep your job security trumps money and it trumps quality, right? This is not uncommon in the B2B world. So we just have to go look for those things, because I guarantee you there are other reasons why people are making decisions. They may just say it's about money or it's about features.
Yeah, and I have a question from my experience dealing with tons of startups for the past years. I'm meeting many founders, brilliant people who are building great technological solution in their countries like Russia, like Asia, like Africa, many locations, and they are successful locally. They are building this successfully their business there, and they have sales. It's growing. It's going pretty well, and but they understand that in order for them to succeed and go global, they need to enter the United States market, because access to capital here is better. The average check per customer is higher, and demand might be even higher as well. So when a new entrepreneur is entering the US market, who never lived here, he has accent, their website is poorly localized, so maybe translated, but they don't look at design, so their local design might be different to what's perceived in terms of design in the United States. I'm not even saying about legal things and understanding their customer doing tests. What would be your recommendations for entrepreneurs who are already successful in their local countries and they make okay revenues or good revenues wherever, but they are trying to access new market and they realize that it's not the same as theirs? How do especially in B2B actually?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think it's much easier if you're looking to the US market, because we are, 300 some odd million people of higher affluence usually than other people around the whole entire world. And it seems like we're a more contiguous culture. Turns out we're not completely, but certainly that looks like an easier entry than, let's say, going to Europe, where you have a cluster of differing countries, some with maybe 3 million people that speak a contiguous language, or 12 million people, et cetera. I completely understand that looks more difficult. The good thing about the US market is that you can access the US every day on Netflix and cable and YouTube, and there's really easy ways to understand what people and Twitter for that matter are looking at, what they're complimenting, what they're complaining about, etc. These are really, there's a lot of ways to do this kind of research out there. At the very least, it's easy to find a set of Americans. Again, go find 12 people in the US that fit your customer group. They're in a business-to-business relationship company. They're in the tech world, if that's what you need, or the media world, or something else entirely. Contact them, ask them. Americans are usually fairly open. Say that you'd like to have a 30-minute conversation with them about their business, what they look at, what they care about, how they make decisions, etc. You can, and then within that context, you could also show them things like, don't tell them it's yours, show them your interface, show them a competitor's interface, etc., and let them react. Listen to what they say. Are they saying it doesn't look professional? Are they saying it doesn't look reliable? Or it doesn't look new enough, meaning it's not using current technology? Is it hard to use? Can they even figure out what it is? Those are pretty easy conversations for anyone to have. Now, if you're going to other locations and cultures, rather than something as big as maybe China or the US, you might need to work a little harder to find those people. But there's tremendous tools out there. You can find people on Twitter. You can find people on Reddit, for instance. You can find people who more than likely will be happy to have a 20 or 30-minute conversation for free to just talk about themselves and their work and their business and react to things.
Yeah, thanks. I completely support that. And to me, being connected to your customer and test your hypothesis right away before you make a bigger move is super important, and brings higher chances of your success. We have another.
I'll add one more thing, and that is, it's also usually not very difficult to just find a reliable person that you can pay just a few dollars. Students are usually pretty good at this, grad students especially, to just spell check or grammar check the text on your website to make sure that, the idioms are correct, the spelling is correct. You would say it, Americans say it in that way, or Norwegians say it in that way, etc. It's more a matter of, we don't think that we could do those things and we just don't do them.
Yeah, I'd say it's a nice recommendation, hiring students for proofreading and something. Yeah, I support it. We have another question, and I suggest we will be wrapping this up because we have more questions. I will let. It's actually again Michael Fox. So we'll let Michael Fox talk. I will have some announcement, and then we will wrap this up with you. So let's go. 1 second, Michael. You can talk now.
That you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with you, Nathan. But it also comes down to understanding your audience. There was a group in Holland that I met with, and I remember they were very successful in the Dutch market, and they wanted to move into the American market. So they took their video and they made it in English, but instead of being for the American market, it was for English-speaking Dutchmen, because they didn't understand it. So the importance of cultural localization, it really comes down to empathy and understanding who you're engaging with and what's important to them. So yet another one of these agile tool sets for it.
Yeah. I see this all the time when I travel through Europe, for instance, and maybe I'm at an ATM or some sort of website that also has English as an option, right? But it's always the UK flag. And so I sometimes miss, looking for my option because I'm looking for the US flag, right? And so we just have to remember, sometimes it's just little things like that we have to get right. I did want to address one of the things in chat, one of the questions we didn't get to, and that was about the fear factor in making strategic decisions today. And the reason why I wanted to focus on that is that it is very obvious that fear right now is heightened for people, and it affects their decisions. And that just underpins my thesis that emotions are incredibly powerful. They need to be understood, and we need to address them when we, message to customers, when we offer them products and services, because they're so powerful. If we know that there's a lot of fear out there in the world, we have to get past it in such a way that we need to make people feel comfortable, that they can reduce their fear for a moment and make a decision that they need to make. And maybe offering them hope or something aspirational is a good way to do that right now. It's probably a good way to do business all the time, but maybe it's even more important now.
Yeah. And you know what's amazing? We are talking right now, you and me, and some people asking questions, but what makes it all amazing, because currently we have people, I just noticed and look at the audience, they are from UK, from New York, from Los Angeles, from Florida, from Russia, from Ukraine. So it's truly global. It's so amazing. Thank you everyone for joining. I have a few quick announcements, and I think it would be a good time for us to wrap up. I don't want to take more time of yours. So as a final statement, I would ask you to maybe close this session with some words of wisdom or your recommendation, or wherever you think is important for the audience to take, to have a key takeaway after our conversation. Slides that I want to share are this. We are having lots of community events almost every week. We won't have much on during holidays, just to let you guys rest a little bit, but there will be more speakers like Nathan, like other great experts and leaders and successful entrepreneurs, investors joining us. So if you guys would like to learn, so feel free to join us. Next week, we'll have Rod Tuvaev and Gennady Daich talking about HIPAA compliant in medtech, and lots of entrepreneurs in that space are entering the United States market, and they have no idea how to be properly compliant. And so instead of right away hiring an expert in that field and pay a lot of money for that, you can ask your questions beforehand. So during our webinar, and maybe your business can benefit. And you can save a little bit of money and have some strategy. There will be another webinar in Russian for Russian-speaking audience, how to raise non-venture capital funding. So like grants, like other sources of capital, and there will be a founder of SWOT telling his story, how he raised non-VC money. I think this is important. We also have another webinar for Russian-speaking audience who would like to test their pitch and pitch to the experts and get feedback. Every Tuesday there will be an opportunity to do that. And we also plan to do the same activity for English-speaking audience. We do have a collaboration with 500 startups, and we launched our initiative that is called Go Global Series with 500 startups alumni. And once a month, we invite one successful alumni from 500 startups to talk about their failures, to talk about things they succeeded, but mostly we don't want to talk about success story. We want to talk about real life where they fall and manage to stand and move on and succeed to get where they are right now, and use this opportunity to join us so you could be able to ask questions to those founders. We do run monthly meetups with founders from around the world. It's the first Friday of the month, which is always in English, and the next one will be first Friday in January, and next month after, the same thing. We have founders joining from all over the world, from United States, South Africa, Italy, Russia, CIS, Australia, Singapore, like really all over the world. And the idea of this networking meetups is to help entrepreneurs to connect and help out each other, find ways where they can bring value to each other within 5 minutes of self-presentation and the problem they're trying to solve and how they can help others. We do have plenty of international partners. Those are large startup ecosystems from different parts of the world. For example, in the United States, we are partnering with Embry-Riddle University in Florida, Expert Dojo in Los Angeles, some venture funds like Unventures. We do a collaboration with 500 startups, as I mentioned. And in Australia, we have collaboration with Gold Coast Innovation Hub. Recently, we had a webinar with them. They even invited local governments so they could give more incentives for startups, and you could ask them directly. Also, we partner with a Collaborativa from Mexico, Skoko Technopark, and various technoparks from Russia and CIS, MindHive from Australia, and on and on. We have tons of more partners which are willing to help you to enter their markets, to use their ecosystem, and so on. If you have any question to us, as I mentioned, you can reach out to me using this email, or learn about us on our website. We are not-for-profit community helping you entrepreneurs to go to the next step and access global markets through the power of network, and helping you to build your global reputation using our network. And hopefully everything we do would take your business to the next step, and you'll get to success. That's it on my end. Nathan, I think this is time to close. And what would be your final words or closing statement for our global audience?
Geez. I think never forget that, strategy is about people, specifically about your customers. And that the more and the deeper you know those people on these qualitative levels, these other kinds of value, the better a business that you could provide, both providing value to them and building it for yourself.
And that was Nathan Shedroff. Nathan, please share your presentation on our global chats. I will text you the links to global chats, so the audience will be able to pick the presentation from our chats. And I wish you great the rest of the day. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we'll have more feedback from people from around the world once the other part of the world wakes up, and we'll have some more people watching us. It was amazing, and I'm hoping to have you on other webinars, and looking forward to working with you. Have a great day, and have the rest of the day, everyone else. Goodbye,
Thank
guys.
you, Danil. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.